Hello, Michael. Welcome on this channel. So great you could join me for a talk on your new book and in theorist philosophy in general. I have an introduction to you here from your own one of your own book. Uh, R. Michael Fisher, Dr. R. Michael Fisher, is a Canadian artist, philosopher, independent scholar, educator, and a fearologist. He's a director of the In Search of Fearlessness Research Institute and an author of many articles and books uh, on transformation and liberation. He's a founder and senior editor of the International Journey of Fear Studies and a recipient of the 2019 Tilmati Fearism Award. Is there anything you would like to add to that?
Well, no, that's good for now. Well, I'll get into it, but just wanted to, this is the book that my latest that you had been sent to me that you'd like to talk about, so I'm looking
Yes,
forward to that.
me too.
Um, Kind of a book basically on the philosophy of education and my critique of education where it's gone. Um, but we can get into that as need be.
This is an interesting talk because my background is heavily in academia, but I'm
Okay.
but I'm myself is also very critical of being in academia because I find that I after after university that's when I truly really became a philosopher and could read on my own and kind of reread without academia on my shoulders. So I think this is a great opportunity to talk about
Yeah, well said. And
critique
so,
of education.
my career as well. Lots of 12 years, I think, of post-secondary education. I can't believe I've actually done, and end up not getting an academic job for a lot of reasons. This would be around the year 2003 when I finished my doctorate. I was certainly looking. And but pretty much I've always been an independent entrepreneur type public intellectual, going back to the 1980s. And, like you, I didn't find a really good fit for myself in academia and kind of oil and water. And, I've had to figure out how to craft my own institutes, right? My own higher education post secondary education, as I sometimes call it, or education for post adults. I even like to throw out that word. What happens after we really grow up? Then how do we learn and exchange and share and solve some problems, hopefully, in the world? So yeah, I'm definitely someone who some people might say, well, how scholarly are you? How well, connected are you in the academic world? And I would say, not very, not very. I'm definitely in the margins, if not in exile, from a lot of that power knowledge dynamic.
Yeah, but let's get into your book, the Fear Problematique, role of philosophy in education in speaking truth and power in powers in the culture of fear. Uh, it's a very difficult book to summarize briefly, but I have tried. So here is a brief summary, and you can add to that. The fear problematique explores the pervasive influence of fear in contemporary society and its implication for education, philosophy, and global crisis. You kind of in the book are leveraging decades of your work on fear and fearlessness and argue that fear is central yet inadequately addressed. Fear is an element in shaping human behavior, educational systems, and social value. Kind of your central argument is that fear often underestimated or even ignored even plays a pivotal role in shaping human systems and behavior. And by adopting a fearlessness perspective, societies and educational system can foster resilience, creativity, and ethical responsibility countering the fear-based paradigms that hinder progress and well-being. So this is my short, briefly summary of the book in general.
That's good. So I thought I would start with some couple stories, short little
Please.
vignettes from real life, and that will guide into a little bit how I stumbled into what we'll call now the fear problematique, which is, now very complicated after 30, 40 years of thinking about how humans are motivated, meta motivated by great forces. And fear is just one. And so, why I'm going to bring up this little intro is I'm going to focus on defense intelligence. So, it's a code word. So, if you don't want to talk about fear, okay, well, let's talk about defense intelligence. So, that's the way I come as a scholar. And one of the reasons I've had to figure out different ways to deliver the news, the critique, the topic even of fear is for a lot of people, they already have built in, and I mean built in, probably mostly culturally built in other words, conditioned in us to already start avoiding the very topic of inquiry itself. This would be similar to, analogously to sex. Oh, let's have a talk about sex. You've already got a raveling back of, quote, almost phobic, if not taboo, cultural taboos,
Yeah.
etc. Right? So I have found the same analogy with fear. My experience just showed over and over, and that was part of the denial, right? This problem of the missing gap in education and our just socializing is that we don't talk much about sexuality and we don't talk much about fearuality. So you can hear I'm playing on analogies to try to help people understand where I'm coming from because it's hard. So the little vignettes I want to share about defense intelligence, which is really how I situate or locate what I'll just call fear and leaving that really broad for now because otherwise we can get into really complex philosophical problems of how to define fear and define it well, not just on the surface. So the little vignettes I want to start with is I was a park naturalist back in my 20s and now 70 plus. So I've had a lot of years thinking about human behavior. And as a park naturalist, I would guide people. And my task was I could see people are already so disconnected from nature. I'm talking about urbanites particularly. And so here I am, this little 22, 23-year-old. I'm already picking up how humans are not sitting well in connection and relationship to nature, for example. And in fact, I kept thinking they're not just disconnected from nature. Sort of the end of the story is the spoiler. People fear nature. And I'm going, we are nature. That means we're fearing ourselves. That means we have a real problem of getting to reality if you're constantly running away from reality, running away from yourself, right? You could use all these different analogies. So I start thinking about, well, is there something teaching us that to run away from nature, run away from ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. And so that gets into really interesting philosophies from the East and the West and onward that I had looked at. But here's the first vignette as being a park naturalist. I take people out in nature because they're coming from the city, and this included kids and tourists. And I would be there and I would guide them on the bus, and we'd come to, for example, this really beautiful, I was working up in this really beautiful forested area and up on the hill, and it's a great view from there. And I'd always take people to that view because it was just so stunning and you could see for miles and miles. And what I noticed over the time I taught for 2 summers is whether it was children or even adolescents, I'm taking them to the edge of this, walking up, and where I'm going to do some kind of naturalist talk about it.
Yeah.
And they've got their cameras out. The cameras are coming out left, right, and center. And this is before iPhones. So this is like 40 years, 50 years before iPhones. You can just imagine what it's like now. And what I was picking up is this 20-year-old of just observing human behavior. I'm like a anthropologist, I'm like a animal behaviorist. I just, what are these creatures doing? When they come to this amazing edge and we're going to look out, and they pull out their cameras. And they pull it out instantly, not just, it's like as soon as they get the gasp of, oh, wow, this is recordable. This is
Mm-hmm.
what I want to send to my friends back home. Take the picture. And what I was realizing is that this was like a buffering mechanism from facing this huge existential space that, puts us in a pretty small little perspective as a human being, as a humble organism.
Yeah.
And there's also realizing at the edge of this cliff, this is danger. Like edge of cliffs, humans, we know we have this innate cliff fear that we find even in babies in labs, at a couple months old. And so all of it I began to realize was this was all a threat. And the camera was the buffer to the threat so that they could get control of that environment and situation
Mm-hmm.
and their own experience. Their own experience. They're getting control of their own experience of having this really complicated, nuanced, animal like, connected, holistic experience. And
Mm-hmm.
so they were declassifying themselves from that environment through the photograph. And it became more important than what their actual experience is. See what I'm saying? Is the buffer was so quick to protect them. And so, you could think of all kinds of things from, the deep existential terror of death, our mortality, our smallness, our ephemeralness, to this great eternal landscape, right, of the awe, of the great wonder. So I wasn't finding the great romantic, thinkers and poets and philosophers in awe of the sublime and the greatness of, no, these are modern, humans with their cameras controlling through
Yeah.
mechanical technologies.
Yeah. And it becomes a defense mechanism against
Bingo.
something
So
fearful.
that's right. So the
Yeah.
defense intelligence was there. We ought to have a defense arise when we walked toward a cliff, huge cliff like that, and it was like 300-foot drop,
Yeah.
whatever. And just the, being in the wild, like, you have to know what you're doing. You have to keep your instincts about you to be in the wild, which is very different than being in your home. So all of that was fascinating to me, and I began to think about, over the years, other kinds of defenses. So now I'm going to nuance what defense means in a really complicated way. I love the image. You probably may remember it. It's a very visceral memory of, and I've seen so many people do it. You're driving in your car with dad, mom, whatever, you're going down the highway,
Mm-hmm.
and it's hot out. You roll down the window.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting this breeze. And then at some point you stick your hand out the window into the air. You know,
Yeah.
your
I
hand
remember.
goes flying back, right?
I
And
remember.
so
Yeah.
and so it takes a few little moments of this very interesting recalibration that the human animal knows what to do is, oh, when you got this great force coming at you, you don't go like this, stop the force. I'm going to try to stabilize myself because you're going to get so much pressure in that defense against the force. And so all you
Mhm.
do is at some point you put your hand like that. And then you notice that your hand starts to undulate.
Yeah.
And you can actually maintain an undulation in a very 60-mile-an-hour wind without hardly any force in your muscles. And that's because the human organism is looking for the least, you know, uh, energetic way to cope with, be with, adapt to environments. We don't like to waste energy. It's built into the entropic, negentropic, physical system of energy, and you know um, that's useful for life. So once you figure out that little undulation, I mean, you can hold it like this, but you actually still get quite a bit of resistance. And because what happens when you undulate, you dip in, and then the wind hits you underneath, and it lifts your hand. That's how a bird wing is designed. That's why birds can fly, and quite effortlessly. They've got a curve and an undulation in their form. So
Yeah.
that, and I just it struck me as that's a defense. That's a defense to the onslaught of environments that nature is not always pretty. It's not always here to make sure you live, by the way.
No.
Right? And again, you
Yeah.
get that existential terror, and it attacks your narcissism that you're not so special
Yeah.
in the big scale. So again, go back to the cliff, the huge wild scenery, people are finding defenses. So the child, through this little experience, to me, is experiencing what I would call the proto emotion of fear. Proto emotion of fear.
Social
You
emotion.
could
Yeah.
then call it, it's like a formative, natural defense strategy. And I would call that a fear patterning that helps you adapt to the world. So right away now, folks, you'll get that I'm not talking about fear as always negative,
No.
even though I called it the fear problematique
Yeah.
in the book. But that's a much more complex problem of why is it a problem? I'm going, that's the problem.
Yeah.
The problem is that we've made fear such a problem.
Yeah. That's yeah. That's also what I kind of get from the book. I
Okay.
just also have to say for my audience who hasn't
Yeah.
read the book and doesn't know that much about what you can call theorism or theology,
Right.
but
Right.
this is also what this book is about, and you have been working on fear and fearlessness for decades. I get a date in the book
Yeah.
since 1989.
Yeah.
What happened that sparked your obsession back then with fear? Was it a moment? Is it a book and a life experience? Can you tell something about it? What sparked this interest in fear in '89?
Yeah. So already I
30 years
was,
ago.
yeah, already, I mean, I'm on a trajectory at that age. So
Yeah.
80, 89, I'm 34 years old, whatever, something like that.
Huh?
And there's some trajectory going on here. And the trajectory was I was an ecological environmentalist.
Hmm.
That was my
Huh?
first career, right? From park naturalist, because automatically I went into the sciences, eco sciences, environmental, and the critique of humanity, the critique of human history that comes when you study ecology and environmental biology. I mean, you cannot not see it, because environmentalism was an issue in the 70s. We were really awakening to the problem, the
Global warming.
global,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
global problematique. In fact, that's where I actually
We
named my
called
book
it the
from.
greenhouse
The
effect.
greenhouse gas was part of it, and the greenhouse effect. So you're in your 20s, you're studying this, and you're going, "That's my future."
Oh,
Like the planet, my society is destroying my future systematically and is not acting to do so and change it, other than very minimalist. And that goes right to today with
yeah.
Donald Trump walking out of the Paris Accord. Can you believe it? An international agreement on greenhouse gases. He walks out. The major, most powerful nation that pollutes more than any other nation. Why would any other nation not follow? They're not going to be too on this problem. I mean, you can just see where we have actually come, right? How many
Yeah.
decades later? Well, why? I would say it's because there's a fear based design in all that. There's a fear based architecture. And
Yeah.
so to get back to 1989, I'm already pre prepared, you see, before this big incident. And I will tell you, it was an intimate relationship with a woman. After a marriage breakdown, two children, living, on my own, but certainly still connected with my children. I'm an educator as well. I'm now got a degree in education. I'm thinking about, the planet and where my children are going to live and what kind of quality environment. So all of that is the pre, but the powerful experience is what I'd call a mystical experience. And everything I've recorded or thought about or read about the mystical experiences, especially that can happen not just in an insight of a meditative, contemplative order of transformation,
Mm.
of a shift in consciousness. You jump out of your frameworks of normal to what might be even a cosmic perspective rather than a cultural ethnocentric perspective, not even a global perspective. It was greater than that. That
Mm.
I jumped out of because I was in this very deep love relationship with this woman, very intense, and I opened my heart to love like never before that I could even imagine. Didn't even know it was possible. And it happens. And then I had this transcendental experience, and she at the same time was having somewhat the same. And sure, it was in a sexual relationship, it was in a sexual, erotic, higher consciousness, the energy flowing up your tantric channels to the top and the bottom. And boom, I'm so wide open and vulnerable and sensitive. And I had this cosmic experience of seeing everything that's happening, and especially in the earthly. And I was looking sort of down in the earthly world. And I said, when I kind of came back out of this trance like mystical sense of experiencing, I just said to my partner, I says, what gets in the way of this experiencing that we're having right now? And we're looking eye to eye, just this glowing, unconditional love. But notice what's happening. I'm already thinking of something bigger. I'm not just thinking of her and I. That wasn't even, you know, the emphasis. So that tells me there's some higher order, the transpersonal, call it what you will. And it said, what gets in the way of this? So there's my problem solver. There's my ecologist, right? Trying to figure out how to solve this problem on the planet of what we're doing to each other and doing to other beings in the future for our
Yeah.
children. So that's where it came. And when we looked at each other and the answer to that, we both said spontaneously, and we had not talked about this previously. It was a new relationship, but we did not talk about it. We both said fear gets in the way. So that's where our defense systems go haywire.
Yeah.
They go into a natural defense of all those things I talked about in those two vignettes, but it starts to go into a protective shield,
Mm.
a wall, right? The camera, the buffering. And our cultures teach us, for the most part, and I say modern industrial cultures, I'll just stick with that because that's what I know the best. In the Western world that I know the best, have buffered us to not experience what I would call a healthy fear very long. We quickly construct it into a defense system of the toxic, pathological, self
Mm.
harming, and collective harming. And so, what's actually happening, we are autonomically, chronically distressed, and that attacks our immune system. All those high chemicals, cortisol, etc., in high distress, a fear response, phobic reaction, and we're constantly undermining our own immune system. It decays. All the research shows the immune system decays, it becomes less effective under high distress, chronic fear, patterning, behaviors, mindset, lens, perception.
Mm.
You see what I'm saying? Our very defense to the universe and the existential threat is now undermining our own defense to live, which is your immune system. So now you know that the system's got its information communicating order messed up. And it happens. You get in what's called a positive feedback loop in systems theory. Instead of the furnace going up to the temperature you set it at and then click, it
Mm.
regulates and then shuts off the heat. In a That's a negative system feedback loop. Positive feedback loop, you get to the heat and it actually reinforces to
Mm.
keep the furnace on.
Yeah.
And that's what's called chronic distress. See, that's not just stress, that's now distress. You've moved into another cycle. So that's my biology and my study of systems theory. I'm going, yeah, that's all your defense system being screwed up. And once it's screwed up, you basically attack yourself. Autoimmune diseases are an attack of yourself against yourself.
Yeah, that's
You're,
always been strange about this autoimmune.
isn't it amazing?
Yeah, uh, there's so many new diseases that are autoimmune diseases, and they don't know really where it come from. It's the body attacking itself. There's nothing
Like,
wrong with you, but the body says no. You must be sick, so the immune system goes
yeah.
it's tipping over the scale. Yeah. Mm.
But so we're talking about the self-correction, right? Or
Yeah.
self-regulation. Those are the words. And now we have a corporate structure controlling most of the great power and wealth of the world, these elite corporate structure. And they don't, the thing that they're fighting for is no regulation. Get the regulations out of government.
Yeah.
And this would be like any fascist government, any totalitarian state. Get the governmental, which represents the public and the elected will of the people. Get that self regulating mechanism out because we don't want to be brought into regulation. And so now you have the big picture of the fear problematique gone super hyper trophied in the global corporate elite. We're now gutting regulations. So getting out of the Paris
Yeah.
Agreement is a way to gut a regulating system. And that's why they want nothing to do with the UN. The UN was at least an attempt to get a collective wisdom on regulating what we might call rogue, arrogant, cancerous, quote, viruses in the system. And of
Yeah.
course, this is the same for digital computer systems. You get those same loops, viruses, we call them, that can destroy systems from the inside because there's no regulation. That's why you have to buy software, right? Security ware. Defense intelligence getting messed up and becoming, basically self undermining. And the common phrase I used as a biologist was, why are we the only species spoiling our own nest systematically? See what I'm saying? That's where it started. So I was already, this is before I understood the fear mechanisms and this fear study that I have done since. Now, the good news is that I says, well, but there's also fearlessness. So systems, even though they will have these self-destructive moments or cycles or times, that's not the design. Their design is not to stay in that mode because there will be no more system left if you stay in that mode. But you do get die-offs, extinctions, all kinds of things. But it seems like the overall arc, and this is that cosmic perspective of evolutionary advance and development, is we seem to have something that does self-correct in
Yeah.
systems. That's
Yeah.
the good news. It's the good news. And so I said, well, what's the self correction of fear? So there becomes now the philosophical question,
Yes. Yeah.
and psychological and sociological. It's like a go across all disciplines. And I'm very transdisciplinary in how I think. A little crazy and wild. And a lot of people don't like that. They wish I would just stay in one discipline.
Yeah.
But
But yeah.
like it's too big of a problem to stay in one discipline.
It seems also for me you're in two camps. You have
Yeah.
a very geek-like rational approach to fear and your study of fear, but on the other hand, you get into talks about transformative and you also mention in the book about things being irrational and irrational. So
Right.
that's also interesting me to
Yeah.
these two camps. That's something that's rational, and that's something that's not rational, and we have to find a central point. Uh,
Yeah. So, just quickly on that, because it is an epistemological,
yeah, before we start.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
an epistemological issue at least that I came across because I realized, my study of fear is only going to be as good as my methodologies are.
yeah,
And I can tell you, there's not too many people that think that way because they think they already know so much about fear. They really do. And it's amazing the arrogance I've picked up because there's some kind of common senseness to it.
Yeah.
And then we've been taught by our parents, we've been taught by the schools how to manage fear. But how many times have we been taught how to investigate fear?
Mm. Zero.
Almost,
Yeah.
almost. A little bit of emotional intelligence now, well, okay, here's something about how we understand our different emotions.
Yeah.
But emotional intelligence education to me is so inadequate. And the reason is it just makes fear just like every other emotion. It's one of a list of 10. And that's where they start the curriculum. And I go, that's a flawed curriculum as far as I'm concerned. Everything tells me fear is not just one of 10 emotions, it's a meta emotion, if you want to call it anything. It controls almost all the other emotions. So
Yeah.
the philosophical issue became, if what's the corrective of fear? I look at the wisdom literatures, for example, in the West, philosophies from the East, from the West, different religions, the Abrahamic religions to the Buddhist and the Eastern, the Asian religions, and so on. And I look in the indigenous teachings and religions. And what do I see? Certainly in a lot, almost universal, and I write that in my first book, The World's Fearlessness Teachings, is I said there's this huge pattern in the literature that repeats that love is the corrective of fear.
Mm.
Which choice are you going to make to follow? Are you going to follow the God of love? Or are you going to follow the God of fear? See,
Yeah.
which is really the satanic or evil or whatever the language would be, depending on
Yeah.
the tradition. And, you could follow the non dual or you could follow the dual
Mm.
in philosophy, for example. Which is going to be your leader? Which is going to be your guide? And so I then troubled that. Um, I said, okay, that's great. There seems to be, we're on to some kind of language, but what does that actually mean? And trying to get beyond just rhetorics and belief systems and ideologies per se, I started trying to keep tweaking and pulling to see what is behind that. And unfortunately, the bad part about it, why I became a fearist, like Desh Suba, who I know you know as
Yeah.
well, and I've talked to on fearism philosophy, is we found because of that long trajectory of putting love and fear as opposite poles,
Yeah.
in that binary oppositional type of thinking, to me it was already flawed ontologically to actually solve the problem of the relationship to fear and fear systems, especially when they get out of control and excessive. What was happening was just another binary. And so you're making one good, one bad.
Yeah.
And what do we do with the bad? Humans have the tendency to put it underneath the covers.
Yeah. Yeah. Throw it away. Yes.
And so all of a sudden, your inquiry, right? Your methodologies of inquiry and making your methodologies more and more powerful, there's no impetus to do that with the bad. So
Mm.
what we do is we go to the good, and that's called virtues. And that's my trouble with virtues ethics. It
Mm.
tends to always push us toward that which looks more positive. It's rewarded by your
Yeah.
society, it's rewarded in the Bible, and blah, blah, blah. And it's going to get you to heaven or enlightenment or something. So, virtues ethics, when you start looking at the fear love problem in this really meta level that I'm talking about, that's where you're going to confront the problem of virtues ethics. Is virtues ethic a solution to the fear problematique? And I say, it's helpful, but it's not
Yeah.
a solution.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
See, we have a few minutes left, so maybe we should just
Yeah. So just before we end,
end
fearlessness
recording.
was my imposition, or at least a hypothetical translation for what's in between the binary, love and fear, is the path of fearlessness. So it's not a matter of trying to go from here to get to there
Uh-huh.
and
Yeah.
skipping, right? Skipping the hard work, skipping the actual path of in and out and up and down and the suffering and the nastiness and the complaint and the hard work of healing, self-regulating. When systems are telling you, don't self-regulate, just get rich, just be successful like everybody else. Don't worry about it. Screw them. all
mm,
for me. Oh, well, I'm going to be a loving, selfish person, or I mean, there's so many combinations of people very selfish still to me,
mm,
but they're riding the horse of love.
mm.
They're all into love and compassion. And I go, and then when I confront them with a little bit of deep knowledge about fear or a little questioning, they're going, "Oh, that's so negative. That's negative energy. You're just going to attract more fear." Anyway, that's the epistemological problem right in the nutshell.
So, Michael, this is a philosophy channel. So I was always interesting to know that do you think philosophy still can play this transformative role in society, or is it now too caught up in this, what you can say, academic elitism and this detachment from reality? Do philosophy still have a role to play for you?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I try to make a distinction between there's always going to be professional philosophers building big careers, getting paid big salaries. And then there's going to be those who are in the populist um, outside of the academy, perhaps, and they're going to be building their careers in media and whatever they do, selling their books. And so, like everyone, philosophers can get caught, to me, of not necessarily speaking truths to power, but rather speaking truths to build their career
Yeah,
and popularity and their ways of thinking that they want to promote, like every philosopher has promoted, and they have their followers and they have their camps, right? So I'm aware of all that, and I'm not like, poo-pooing any of that. It has a role to play, and it always has historically, way back. So my concern is that, and I say, I think in the book that philosophers of education, at least, which is my specialty, I think have missed the boat. I think they've been too hung up on being popular, building careers, getting acceptance, often from the state and or their university that's paid by the state. Right? There's a lot of economic reasons philosophers do not speak truths to power. They may lose status in their organizations professionally and or through their institutions like everybody else. They're susceptible. Now, arguably,
that's
there are
true.
really good ones. There are really good ones who don't. And for especially if you become very, very successful and you don't need, that job, then you can maybe speak a bit more, truths to power, and you don't care what people think, and nobody's going to fire you because you're too valuable to them because you're so popular. This would be like
Mm.
someone like Zizek, for example. He can do anything he wants, and nobody's gonna do anything because he doesn't need anybody. He's made it,
Yeah,
So those are just a few of the conditions that compromise philosophy for what it is. But let me go back to the core of how I understand philosophy
yes,
is that
please.
it questions. Philosophy questions. And there's no other discipline that is actually built upon questioning the questions. In
Mm.
other words, I'm not even satisfied we're asking the right question about the question of the problem of XYZ.
Mm.
There's no other discipline that does that. There's no other discipline that has that orientation. So at its core, it is core to a healthy society that can stay in touch with reality. I think that is the core of philosophy, is to stay in, a love of knowledge to the point that helps us get in touch with reality. And, and we can also call that gets in touch with knowing our true self. Know thyself.
Know
So
thyself. Yeah.
right. So those are all there. And what my critique, I think, I'm not sure I do it in this book. You might have read it or not, but when I say philosophers of education, at least, have missed the boat, and I think a lot of Western philosophers have missed the boat, in that they haven't paid attention to the fear problematique that's been accumulating throughout human history. And it is now what I say, it's way ahead of us. It's like a tsunami already going. And we are so behind in our methodologies, our awareness, our capabilities to actually know how to manage that fear and the complexity of what's become this toxic fear patterning, culture of fear, as some people are articulating. So the good news is that philosophers could easily, and I try to do it in my little way, is to say, know thy fearful self is actually more important than know thyself now, at this point in history. See what I'm saying? Contextually.
It is really now because I'm kind of fearful every day with what's going on in the world and with Donald Trump. And
You have children,
I have small children, so I worry
small children.
about what will their future be. I don't. It's not important what happens to me. I'm a full
Yeah,
grown man. I've lived my life, but what about them? What kind of a world they grew up in? So I'm fearful about that, kind of like every day, and I actually try to avoid the news if possible, and
sure.
because it's so depressing what's going
Yeah,
on. It's so messed up. Uh, so I think this about fear is so in our everyday life, especially now in this moment. So we have to understand it. I have to understand it. That's why I'm so interested in you and this super's work because
who do you go to? Who's your go-to for understanding fear from your philosophical and all your sort of ways that you like to come to knowledge and inquiry?
but you're kind of right that there's not many philosophers talking about it. So I kind of go to you or to this super, or I try to cook up my own understanding of what it means. But I just come to the revelation that it's important because fear is so much a part about my life now because of what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
Well,
How about how about
if you
Denmark?
go back 5 years, I wasn't that fearful about the
Okay,
future
yeah,
because things seemed okay. There was always a problem about the environment, but it
for
didn't.
sure.
But that's even also pressured now because nothing's going to be done about it now. They're in trade
Very little.
wars and World War III and Donald Trump, and so it's nobody
Yeah,
talks about the environment anymore. Not these
right.
in the
So
media.
then, so then, to me, the question I would put to you, because as a fear analyst, I would go, okay, so are you interested in a notion of fearlessness? Or do you think courage is enough? Do you think bravery is enough? You've been a philosopher thinking a lot about those things, I'm sure, here and
Yeah,
there.
you're right. This what you talk about fearlessness. That I would like to be fearless or have fearlessness. They feel
Yeah, I
it.
see it.
So, but it's difficult to understand what it really is. Is it bravery or something more? I would like you to go into that because
I would like to.
or, but before the break, I thought about something when you talked about love as the
Sure,
opposite of fear.
sure.
I kind of saw it like yin and yang, where fear and love they're not opposites; they're just two sides of the same coin.
Mhm.
Is that a way to think about
Yeah,
it?
I think it's a start. I think it's
Yeah,
a start. It's a start to get out of dualism,
yeah,
right? To move to a dialecticism.
dialecticism. Yeah, yeah,
So if you put it into the yin yang idea of two sides of the same coin, at least then you can say, well, that means each of them is influencing each other
yeah,
in their evolution, in their dynamic. In other words, there's no pure. See, once you move to dialecticism, see, there's no purity to them. They are co related, they're co emerging, co evolving. And that's the problem with this transcendental absolutism of values that are put as virtues that become, they are like God. See, God's quality is love. God is love. Well, once you
yeah,
do that, you're just like, what world are you in? This is so abstracted. It's a nice idea.
yeah,
And the partial reality to it is love is important. You see it phenomenologically, we know that as humans.
yeah,
But then you get to issues of, but what about the world we live in? Now that the researcher, the thinker, any of us, we have to come down. off our high horse of love, is what I basically say. And that's not very popular when I say that. And I do try to offer this alternative fearlessness. So maybe if I will just say a little bit about the trajectory of my research in this, what I call this trajectory of fearlessness.
Please do. Yeah.
And it came after lots of years of thinking and studying how do people talk about bravery, because that's kind of a on the path of fearlessness,
Hmm.
bravery.
Bravery.
But
Yeah.
but when I had the mystical experience that I shared in the last part one with you,
Yeah.
when I said fear is what gets in the way, I didn't finish the story.
Please do.
And then I said to my partner, let's start a project in search of fearlessness on the planet. Notice I did not say let's start a project love on the planet. Why? Because it's already been done. It's already been tried. The
Yeah.
religions of love are enormous. The theologies, the philosophies of love. And I said, okay, not that bad, but I don't think it's helping all that much. Like the serious problems that we're in, really serious global problems. So that's why I said, let's start this project fearlessness. So that's where I started thinking, so what's the other kind of language for fearlessness that I could analyze and maybe see and make sense of? And because I'm now going to talk about I'm a developmentalist, I have to admit that so everybody knows. In other words, I'm a structuralist in part. I also believe in post-structuralist analysis and critique that doesn't get it too attached to phases and stages and rigid linear development. But I also say I think there is some development that goes on in biological systems and cultural systems. And so I'm not willing to throw out the baby with the bathwater and just say, there's no structure, it's all just difference.
Mm.
No, no. So I'm going to give you now a developmental perspective of fearlessness in a nutshell, very short nutshell, which
Yeah.
takes me a couple chapters, 3 or 4 chapters in my very first book, The World's Fearlessness Teachings. So I'm reading all this literature, trying to go across cultures as much as I can. Of course, you can't do everything, and across time. So I'm really wanting a universal possible model here, right? Or theory I'm working on, a fear management theory based on the idea of a developmental model or spectrum of fearlessness. And that's going from what I've called no fear to fearless. That what you have written on the board, fearless, behind
Yeah.
you, that's to me the highest end of the spectrum, the most mature, the most integrated, the most holistic, the most potent in a certain way of consciousness development. At the lowest end is what I call no fear. And there's a whole understanding discourse that could be written about no fear. And that's pretty much the zygote, once it's made and
Mm.
has 9 months in the mother's womb. That probably is a pretty good place to understand what no fear means for a
Mm.
lot of different reasons. The ego hasn't developed yet. The sense of self that's separate has not developed yet, right? So we're now into pre-dual or a dual.
Mm.
And so that is why I call it no fear, a dual. Once you get a little bit older, then especially once you're yanked out of the womb and often not very friendly, yanked out into a world that's kind of rough sometimes and scary. And then you have to deal with all the existential terrors of existence and all the fear, right, of everybody else around you, not just your own. You're picking up mom and dad's fear, you're picking up the environmental fear in the birthing room, etc.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden now you're into the beginning of a fear-based life starting to accumulate. Okay, that's fine because the I'm saying the end goal, right? The end image of this theory is you can move to a place of fearlessness, of fearless. That would be like a fearless place. So my theory is actually built on a fearless standpoint. I couldn't architect this theory unless I was already taking a non-dual fearless standpoint. So I use a fearless standpoint theory to help me try to organize and understand. Not everybody does that. Hardly anybody does that with fear research. Like that's so rare.
Mm.
So that's what I'm doing. So no fear, you'll notice, is kind of at the other tail end of fearless. Well, they actually are kind of the same reality, but one is very matured and one is naive. It's the beginning. It, but they actually are in the same kind of location outside of that fear matrix. So everything in between is the fear matrix operating.
Yeah.
So I use that theory. And then first, let's go to bravery. So once you get into the fear world, what's happening is your defense mechanisms, all your defense intelligence. Remember, when I talk about fearlessness, I'm talking about the basic structure or form or architecture. Fearlessness is the architecture of defense intelligence, maturing in a kind of spiral movement, sometimes going backward, regressing, sometimes advancing, and then usually stopping about halfway
Yeah.
and not maturing because societies and cultures don't want citizens who are moving into fearlessness and fearless at that high level end. The kind of Gandhis of the world, Martin Luther Kings of the world,
Mm.
etc. That those are not the kind of people you can control very well.
Mm.
All right. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of forces pushing on this development, right? This arc, this instinct to move to fearless. In other words, I'm saying that's our instinct. That's the highest form of defense intelligence. And who knows, I'm not saying it ends there. It's like it's who's living there? Well, not me. I mean, I can take it as a standpoint. I can maybe look for exemplars in history or my own life. I may touch it at moments. Yes, I probably do. You probably do. But let's just take one of your child. Falls into the river. You didn't know she was going to fall in, or he, and they're starting to go downstream. Really dangerous situation. You jump in anyway.
Yeah.
That's bravery.
Yeah.
So that's the first on the spectrum. Is we develop this first part of fearlessness in its earliest stages, which is what I'll call bravery. And I try to analyze the literatures on the definitions and meanings that people give for bravery. And they're not all consistent. But when I started putting them together, I went, they all kind of point to this. And at least I think that's how bravery is actually the accurate word. It's when you don't have to think a lot about doing something brave. You just do it.
Yeah.
And that's because of all kinds of conditioning. You're a dad, you're a father, you belong in the army, and when somebody's getting shot, your buddy, you go in and you put yourself in harm's way. See what I'm saying? It's trained, conditioned, it's kind of using that animal instinct of fight, flight, survive at all costs kind of thing.
I
So
see.
I kind of
Mm.
call that's so I call it the bravery discourse. It's and the discourse just kind of means it's all our sort of values, our assumptions, the ways we speak and write and teach. I call that's that discourse. So I like Foucault on his analysis of discourses through history, right? So Michel Foucault. So that's what I was looking for. That's the bravery discourse. Okay, and that evolves through time, and it's not just a big jump. You still have it, but you kind of transcend it developmentally. And that's how developmental theory works. You include the stage before, some of its aspects, but the situation of the environment has gotten more complex, it has more problems that stage of development and structuration cannot handle. It needs to advance. And that's what drives evolution is adaptive responding to environmental change. And so developmentally, you move to the next stage of fearlessness, which is courage, courageousness.
Bravery in church. Yeah.
So
Mm.
now we're moving from less that quick response, not thinking a lot, to now courage, and courageousness involves internalizing and questioning risk. You have time. And it brings in a moral principle as well into that, thinking through rational analysis, whatever you're processing. And courage and courageous is way more depth. You can hear it. It's got this huge interiority of complexity compared to bravery.
Yeah.
And it's going to have a lot more autonomy in it, right? Where I could actually choose to not follow the crowd. Bravery is usually you're following a role script or a training, or that's what you're supposed to do if you're a soldier or a dad and your child falls in the river, right?
Yeah.
It's like you don't get that courageousness. It's there, it's impacting you, your conformist and your valuation by the society or your wife or your whatever, right? How they're going to value you when you make a courageous choice or a job. You
Mm.
could get fired. You could get fired if you're courageous. Step on somebody's toes. So a lot of fear, you're still trying to process and manage, but you're using this long worked out, and it's an incredible intelligence of courageousness. All right, so what's next? So that's where most literature stop. So fear management usually stops right there.
Yeah.
Theories and ideas and teaching and training. We might teach people how to be, brave and courageous, but that's pretty much most 99% of where we stop our curriculum. And that's where I'm trying to expand the curriculum to these next three levels. So the next level I call fear dash less. And I won't go into it in detail, but it's basically the best of bravery, courageousness. But what it's now doing is as you're working out the decisions to be fear dash less, you are working on a level of I am here in whatever decisions I make to bring less fear into the world. Fear dash less, not just for me, but less fear into the world. And there's leaders that have had that, definitely the Gandhis and so on. They're not just operating on courage. They are thinking big picture. They're thinking of moral, ethical evolution of humankind and consciousness to a higher level. So
Yeah.
this takes higher level cognitive capability, education. You have to be more educated often to make those kind of decisions, but not always. Some people just seem to have it. But I would say most of us, we have to educate ourselves to get to that level. And what you're starting to do is see that the decision I make in this fear dash less is it's a decision that's being made in the fear matrix itself of the world that's controlling and oppressing virtually everybody and taking this planet down. See, you already start to have this global sense of the context. Courageousness, you don't always have that global sense of the context. You're just kind of thinking this would be the courageous thing to do because it's wrong what they're doing, and there's a justice injustice battle. Not when you get to fearless, you're starting to think about the fear matrix, that the world is based on people using fear against other people. And so my goal when I make that positioning or take that enacting fear dash less, that's what I'm aware of, that I want to bring less fear into the world.
Yeah.
Makes sense? It's kind of a negative philosophy compared to courage being the positive philosophy of being braver and braver. It's more than negative, beginning of negative philosophy, right? What can I take away that will improve the world? Not what just can I add?
Mm.
More complicated.
Yeah. I was
Two more
thinking
stage.
about,
Go ahead.
would you call yourself
Yeah.
fearless
Yeah,
to some extent?
I'm definitely fear dash less centered.
Yeah.
I definitely am. There's no doubt about that. And that took a bit of time. It didn't happen when I was in my youth. It didn't happen before 1989. But I was growing in that direction. And I wasn't like a particularly brave, courageous, amazing human being. I'm not really. I'm pretty ordinary. So, but something happened, right? I had that huge mystical experience and that popped me too. So then I began to realize in my research there's still two more stages after that, fearless. And I argue that there's a fear barrier ontologically and epistemologically that you have to cross. This is like the initiation path of, of the warrior, of the hero, of the shiro, whatever. Like, in fact, I have, there's three barriers in my model, fear barriers, I call them, but I'm just going to give you the one here, which is a major one, because it's hard enough to get to fear dash less, and it's like crossing the abyss to get to fearlessness. So I'm not using fearless yet, fearlessness, one
Mm.
word. And that's where I operate as a philosopher, thinker. That gives me the big picture. And there's another, structure behind that. It's called integral consciousness or vision logic. Developmental people have discovered this, and it's a very higher order of rational, logical analysis and thinking and capacity. And you're able to see the whole spectrum of possibilities, even though you may not be operating on the highest or the lowest. You can at least see them all. That's huge. That's huge to be able to see the spectrum of choices and possibilities, and therefore have compassion for people who are operating at different levels.
Mm.
Instead of judging them and saying, oh, you're this, or you're so immature, or you're lower, that's never gonna, you're less ethical. Now, some of those things might be true, but it's like you don't judge people for that. Where they're at, where they're at. That's not to be judged, right? It's like this radical acceptance. So that's what happens at fearlessness. And the reason it's happening, there's a very complicated, because fearlessness is really complicated, as I write in my work.
Mm.
And it's in that book, the Fear Problematique. I'm saying that we need fearlessness as a perspective for designing curriculum and education. And I'm basically saying if we don't do it, we're pretty much done. Fear is going to wipe us all out. There'll still be life on the planet and other things, but humans are reaching their max unless they can regulate in a new way. And I'm saying we're going to have to get to a lot, at least our best leaders, and getting to fearlessness.
Yeah, that's probably
Don't
problematic
expect,
right now.
yeah, don't expect everybody to get there. You
Uh,
know, you just can't expect it because developmentally it's not going to happen. People can't jump from grade three to, first year processing, or graduate level processing. I mean, it is developmental for a reason. It's because you have to work through that path of fearlessness on the way. But notice what I'm saying is it's all fearlessness. Fearlessness never disappears. That's the theory. You see, that's my ontological theory. And so it's based on the
yeah,
assumption, the dictum that when fear appears, so then does fearlessness. That's the dictum, and you probably saw it in the book.
yeah,
That is core to the way I teach, and I think it's the only way to really feel optimistic about what's happening. Is that yes, you, Casper, may in this moment have a lot of fear about what's going on for your children, the world, and at the same moment you just go, "Yep, that's true, I do." And at the same moment, if I use that dictum or this theory, if you at least just try it on and see if it's interesting or useful, and at the same time that fear is arising, so then is fearlessness, the spirit of fearlessness, because that's the self-regulatory control. So the fear cycle doesn't take off. It's a corrective. It's
yeah.
built into our systems. It's 4 billion plus years old in
Yeah.
living systems.
Well, I do sometimes operate on two levels where I can
Oh yeah.
be fearful, have a lot of fears, but then at the same moment, not really being that afraid. Ah, it's gonna work out.
Yeah. Or you step up and you do
Right,
these
it's something
videos.
new. That's all this kind of reassurance
Yeah.
feeling coming up. So,
Yeah. That can involve faith, but it also can involve a reasonable logical judgment.
mhm.
And it can involve a theory or philosophy that's actually worked out with a lot of thought. Like my philosophy is worked out with a lot of thought. Again, it might have problems and flaws and so on. Go ahead, people, rip it apart. I'd be glad to talk to anybody trying to improve it.
Mm.
So then let's get to the last level after fearlessness. After
Yeah,
you can sort of see the whole spectrum, then there's another big fear barrier, another abyss to cross. And that is what I would say is the crossing into the non dual. What's called non dual consciousness. Right, fearlessness is right at that edge, and it's starting to be influenced by the non-dual, but to actually center of gravity of yourself, your everyday, into the non-dual. That's very elite. That's like the monk who sits in contemplation, for 50 years, has this, ability to be in fearless. So, and there's a few other examples we could play with, but I'm just they're all typing and they're all generalizations. So people may say, well, this is a fine theory, but I want examples of everything. Well, I do give examples in my book, The Fearlessness Teachings in 2010. I do try to articulate a little bit in the Fear Problematique book. But the main thing in the Fear Problematique book that you brought this conversation about, Casper, is just that. It's I'm bringing a new referent, right? Rather than a fear-based referent or a love-based referent as the corrective, I'm saying no, there's a developmental nuance referent. And that's what this path of fearlessness would be. And the very simple practical is, well, Mike, yeah, what are you trying to do? I just want schools to do fear education, just like they could do sex education. And so then I came up with the concept that I think is really useful to help people is if we have sexuality in the human condition, human nature, we also have fearuality in human nature and the human condition. Where are our courses, our teachings on fearuality coming from? We don't even have the word. So I coined the word. See where we're at?
Yeah,
That's how
very
early we are. We're so behind the eight ball, we don't even coin it because we haven't made our fearuality a subject of inquiry.
yeah. It's tabularized. It's I don't know. Yeah, we don't really have. Yeah, I think I get it. That's interesting.
Any other questions or thoughts? We got about 6 minutes.
Yeah. One last. You write about in the book that this is probably your last book. Is this it? Is this have you come to the end of your fear study?
Yes and no. I always have more. But what I've come to at the end of this book was I have said it all, more or less.
More or less, yeah.
It took me 35 years to say it all. And that's, hundreds of different writings, publishings in different ways, um, videos, etc. Right? It's like once you sort of get the teachings out there and they're now recorded, they're in the archives of human history. Yeah, everything's going to be a tweak after that.
Yeah.
I don't think there'll be any new big discoveries for me in fear studies. But what I'm doing now is trying to support others, and I mentor a lot, graduate students or and things like that. I'm trying to encourage them to at least look and think about this stuff. And of course, some don't want to and don't have to, and that's fine. But I at least I've kind of come to that place in my life. I'm 73 years old, and I know that I've pretty much done the teaching that I needed to do for my research. I have tons of data I've never analyzed. It's in box loads and file folders. So this is an advertisement. If there's a post grad or a graduate student or an undergrad student or anyone just interested, you'd have to come to my place, and I'll give you all this stuff and let you analyze it because I'm not going to. I'm tired. I'm too old. I collected it when I was very young and youthful. And that's what we do as researchers, right? We collect way more than we can analyze,
Mm.
way more than we can ever write about and synthesize. And that's just the way it is for us. We're limited. And so it's the next generations that can pick up and take that work and develop it. So that's why I still feel very energetic and willing to do these kinds of conversations because of the passion's still there. But it's like I know that work is, in that sense, come to an end for me. Um,
Well, thank you so much for being on this channel to talk about your important work, and it's been so great. I'm so thankful. So for my viewers, I will put a link in the description where you can buy Fisher's book, but maybe you should start with one of his earlier book and work your way up because this seems like it could be the end for all the books. This.
Yeah, and it focuses on education, which is my field. Whereas that World's Fearlessness Teachings book, um, right? That was kind of 20 plus years to write that book, and it gives that theory a lot of the base, even though it's now a bit out of date on a lot of things, parts, and things do get out of date for me, but it does have the foundations that I'm sure I'll carry to my deathbed. Thanks very much, Casper, for this.
You too. Thank you very much. And maybe we could have a talk another time
Yeah,
about some topic or something. That would be nice.
all the
But
best.
take care. Thank
Thank you.
you. Bye bye.